All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something, well, it's a bit meta. We're talking about concepts. And yeah, I know that might sound super abstract, like head in the clouds philosopher
Oh,
stuff.
absolutely. It can get pretty deep.
But think about it. Concepts, those are like the building blocks of, well, of thinking itself. They're how we make sense of, well, everything from categorizing the world to making inferences to remembering even the smallest things like what you had for breakfast.
It really is fascinating when you stop and consider it. We use concepts constantly without even realizing it.
It's true. And that's kind of our mission today. Like, how does a philosopher actually try to analyze and understand something so fundamental yet so elusive? We're going to unpack the major theories and debates surrounding concepts.
And trust me, there are a lot of them. Philosophers have been grappling with this for centuries, and there are some deeply opposing approaches.
Right. But luckily, we have a roadmap. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on concepts. It's really well structured. It breaks the whole thing down into 5 key issues.
A framework, if you will.
Exactly. A framework. So just to lay it out for you, we'll be tackling first the ontology of concepts. That's just a fancy way of asking what kind of things are concepts, really? Mental entities, abilities, something else entirely.
The fundamental what are they question.
Right. Then second, we'll look at the structure of concepts. How are they organized internally? Like, are they like dictionary definitions or something more fluid? Then third, we'll get into the age-old debate of empiricism versus nativism. Where do our concepts come from experience, or are we born with them?
Nature versus nurture for the mind.
Yeah, exactly. Fourth, we'll tackle the relationship between concepts and language. Like, can you even have thoughts without words?
A question that's trickier than it sounds.
For sure. And finally, we'll look at the role concepts play in, well, doing philosophy itself. Specifically, the whole method of conceptual analysis. It's a packed agenda, I know, but we're aiming for those aha moments where complex ideas suddenly click.
And hopefully some thought-provoking questions for you to ponder.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. Starting with, as any good philosopher would, the ontology of concepts. What are these things at their core?
Well, the Stanford entry lays out three main positions. The first, and maybe the most familiar one, especially in cognitive science, is the idea that concepts are mental representations.
Okay, so like representations of what exactly?
Think of it in terms of the representational theory of mind. It's the idea that our mental life, our thoughts, beliefs, desires, are all made up of these internal symbols that stand for things in the world.
So like a mental picture of a cat represents the actual furry creature.
Sort of, but it's more abstract than that. It's not necessarily a visual image. It's more like a symbol, a mental word that stands for the concept of cat.
I see. And these mental words, they combine to form more complex thoughts, right?
Exactly. That's where Jerry Fodor's language of thought hypothesis comes in. He argues that these mental representations have a kind of syntax, a grammar, that allows us to combine them in meaningful ways, just like words in a sentence.
Ah, so that explains how we can generate such a vast and complex range of thoughts.
Precisely. This view is appealing because it helps explain the productivity of thought, our ability to create new thoughts and understand new ideas. It also offers a way to understand how our thinking can be rational, how we can follow logical rules.
It's like our minds have their own internal logic built on these mental representations.
In a way, yes, but of course, no philosophical theory is without its critics.
Right, there are always counter-arguments.
Of course. For example, Daniel Dennett argues that we don't consciously entertain all of our beliefs all the time. Like, do you have an explicit mental representation for the belief that apples don't fly right now?
Well, no, not actively, but I do believe that.
Exactly. So how does that work if all beliefs are mental representations? There are also other models of the mind, like connectionism, that don't rely on these discrete symbolic representations.
So it's not a settled issue, even within cognitive science. Interesting. What's the second contender in this philosophical battle royale?
The second view shifts the focus away from mental things and instead sees concepts as abilities.
Abilities. Like the ability to ride a bike.
Not quite. Think of it more like a specific kind of cognitive skill. So the concept C8 isn't a mental picture or a word, but your ability to recognize cats, to distinguish them from other animals, to understand their behavior.
So like knowing a cat when you see one.
Yes, but also being able to draw inferences about them, knowing that they might purr or scratch or chase mice.
It's a more practical, hands-on kind of understanding?
Exactly. Philosophers like Michael Dummett and Anthony Kenny have argued for this view. They see it as a way to avoid some of the problems with mental representations, like the issue of explaining how we understand those representations in the first place. It also aligns with Wittgenstein's focus on language as a public social practice.
But how does this view account for the productivity of thought? If concepts are just abilities, how do we combine them to form new thoughts?
That's one of the main challenges for this view. It's not easy to explain how abilities, in themselves, can be combined in the same way that we seem to combine concepts to generate new ideas.
It's like saying that knowing how to bake a cake and knowing how to ride a bike somehow combine to give you the ability to, I don't know, bake a cake while riding a bike.
Right, it doesn't quite work that way. Some argue that ultimately even these abilities might rely on some underlying representational system, which brings us back to the first view.
A philosophical roundabout. Okay, so what's the third option on the table?
The third view takes a more radical approach. It says that concepts aren't mental entities at all, but rather abstract objects.
Abstract objects, like existing out there in some platonic realm of forms.
It's a bit like that. This view is most closely associated with Gottlob Frege, who distinguished between the sense and the reference of a word. The reference is the actual thing in the world that the word picks out. The sense is the way that the word presents that thing, the mode of presentation.
So like the morning star and the evening star both refer to the planet Venus.
Exactly. But they present it in different ways. They have different senses, different concepts associated with them. That's why the statement, the morning star is the evening star, is informative, even though both terms refer to the same object.
Because you're learning that two different ways of thinking about the same thing are actually referring to the same thing.
Precisely. Philosophers like Christopher Peacock have developed this view further, arguing that concepts as abstract objects can explain the fine-grained nature of our thoughts and how we can grasp concepts that no one has ever thought of before.
Okay, but how do we, as embodied beings, interact with these abstract entities? How do we grasp them, so to speak?
That's a major challenge for this view. W.V. O'Quine, for example, was very skeptical of abstract objects, arguing that they have no place in a scientific worldview. And even if they exist, how do they causally interact with our minds?
It's like trying to grab hold of a shadow.
Right. Some argue that these abstract concepts might be the types that our mental representations belong to, trying to bridge the gap between the mental and the abstract.
So maybe it's not an either, but more about how these levels relate. But before we get too deep into that, maybe we should ask, is this whole debate just about words?
Ah, a good metaphilosophical question. Are we just arguing about definitions?
Right, like could we just say concept means mental representation in one context, ability in another, and abstract object in yet another, and call it a day?
Well, most philosophers would say it's more than just semantics. The way we understand concepts has real implications for how we study the mind, how we analyze language, and even how we do philosophy itself. It's about fundamental commitments, not just labels.
So the stakes are high. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and tackle the second big question. The structure of concepts. For a philosopher, how are these things organized?
Right, so now we're getting into the internal workings of concepts, specifically lexical concepts, the ones tied to individual words. And here, the starting point is often the classical theory.
A classical theory. Sounds traditional.
It is. It's the idea that a concept is structured like a definition. You have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under that concept. The classic example is bachelor, defined as unmarried man. To be a bachelor, you have to be both unmarried and a man. No exception.
Nice and clear cut, black and white.
Exactly. For philosophers who like things neat and tidy, this is appealing. It gives you a clear way to understand how we learn concepts, how we categorize things, how we even determine what a word refers to.
And it fits with that traditional philosophical method, conceptual analysis, right? Where you break down a concept into its core components.
Precisely. But, of course, there are problems. One big one is, well, people don't always categorize things so rigidly.
Oh yeah, the messy reality of human thinking.
Right. Psychologists have found these things called typicality effects. Like, if you ask people to name a fruit, they're more likely to say apple than durian, even though both are fruits.
Apples are just more, typical, more fruity in our minds.
Exactly. The classical theory doesn't explain that. It also struggles with, well, actually finding those clear-cut definitions for a lot of concepts.
Especially the big ones, right? Like knowledge, truth, justice. Those get tricky.
Absolutely. Philosophers have been trying to define knowledge for centuries, and we're still debating it. So that leads to alternative theories, like the prototype theory.
The prototype theory, like the original model.
Not quite. It's more like the typical example. This theory says that concepts are organized around prototypes rather than strict definitions. So your concept of bird might be based on a robin or a sparrow, something that flies, sings, has feathers.
So a penguin is still a bird, but it's less birdy than a robin in our minds.
Exactly. Categorization becomes a matter of comparing something to the prototype and judging its similarity. It explains typicality effects quite well.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing there are problems with this view, too.
Of course. One issue is that it doesn't always capture how we make reflective judgments. Like, if you surgically altered a dog to look and act exactly like a raccoon, we'd still probably say it's a dog based on its underlying essence.
Right, still a dog, on the inside.
Exactly. Prototype theory also has trouble with compositionality, how the prototypes of individual words combine to form more complex concepts. Like, what's the prototype of pet fish?
Yeah, that's a weird one. Hard to picture.
Right. And some concepts like chairs purchased on a Wednesday don't seem to have prototypes at all.
So prototypes are useful, but maybe not the whole story. What other options are there?
Well, a popular one these days is the theory. It draws an analogy between our concepts and scientific theories.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So, in a scientific theory, the meaning of a term is determined by its role in the theory, its relationships to other terms. The theory says the same thing about concepts. Their meaning comes from how they fit into our overall understanding of the world.
So my concept of dialogy isn't just a list of features. It's connected to my knowledge of biology, animal behavior, my personal experiences with dogs.
Exactly. It explains why we'd still call that raccoon-looking dog a dog. Our dog theory tells us it's about more than just appearance.
It's about its dogness, its essence.
Exactly. This view also suggests that learning new things can actually change our concepts, like a scientific revolution. But it faces the problem of holism.
Holism, like the whole being greater than the sum of its parts.
Sort of. The problem is, if the meaning of a concept is tied to my entire web of beliefs, and yours is tied to your web, which might be different, how can we be said to share the same concept?
Like, how can we even talk to each other if our concepts are so personalized?
Exactly. That's a big challenge for the theory. There are also debates about whether children's conceptual development really looks like scientific theory change.
Right, it's a complex process.
Mhm.
Okay, we've gone from definitions to prototypes to theories. What's next on this philosophical journey?
Well, next up we have a pretty radical view, conceptual atomism. It says that lexical concepts, those tied to words, have no semantic structure at all.
No structure, like they're just empty vessels.
Not exactly empty, but their meaning comes entirely from their connection to the world. It's inspired by the work of Kripke and Putnam on reference. They argued that the meaning of a name, like Aristotle, isn't a description, but just a direct link to the actual person.
So, like, my concept of DOG is just a pointer to all the dogs out there in the world.
Essentially, yes. The meaning is determined by that causal link, not by any internal features or definitions.
It's a very minimalist view of concepts. But what about our experience of understanding a concept?
Atomists would say that those experiences are just psychological baggage, not part of the concept's meaning. The meaning is purely external.
Okay, so we've gone from highly structured concepts to ones with no structure at all. It seems like philosophers can't agree on what concepts are made of.
And that leads to two final positions, pluralism and eliminativism. Pluralism says maybe there's no single type of conceptual structure. Maybe different concepts have different structures, or even the same concept can be structured differently in different contexts.
So, like, my concept of bird might be prototype-based when I'm quickly identifying birds, but more theory-like when I'm thinking about their evolution.
Exactly. One version of pluralism even suggests that what we call cat might actually be multiple distinct concepts, each playing a different role in our thinking.
So many cats. But then there's eliminativism, which takes a more drastic approach.
Right. Eliminativists argue that, given all this diversity, maybe concept itself isn't a useful scientific category. Maybe we should just get rid of the word and talk about the specific representations and processes instead.
Like, throw out the whole concept of concept.
Well, they're not saying our minds don't categorize or represent the world. They're saying that concept might be too broad and vague a term to be scientifically useful.
It's like saying vegetable isn't a real category because there are so many different types of vegetables. Okay, so that's the structure debate. Lots of options, no clear winner.
Philosophy in a nutshell. But we've got one more big question to tackle. Where do these concepts come from? The empiricism versus nativism battle.
The age-old nature versus nurture debate. applied to our thoughts.
Exactly. And cognitive science has really breathed new life into this debate. We have so much more data now about how children learn, how brains develop, how other animals think.
So it's not just armchair philosophy anymore.
Not at all. Empiricists like Locke and Hume traditionally argued that all our concepts come from experience. Our minds are blank slates at birth, and we build up our conceptual repertoire through sensory input and association.
We learn by experiencing the world.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
But modern empiricism is more nuanced. It focuses on the psychological relationship between our concepts and our perceptual and motor systems, even if those concepts aren't simple copies of sensations.
You mentioned Shapiro's embodied mind thesis. How does that fit in?
Well, Shapiro argues that our bodily experiences, the way we move and interact with the world, fundamentally shape how we think and conceptualize. Our concepts are grounded in our embodiment.
So like our concept of grasping is shaped by our experience of having hands.
Exactly. And Prinz, another contemporary empiricist, argues that all our concepts are ultimately built from perceptual representations, even abstract ones. He suggests that having a concept is like being able to simulate a perceptual experience in your mind.
But how do you simulate the experience of something like truth or justice?
That's a challenge for empiricism, for sure. Prinz suggests that maybe logical concepts are more like mental operations than representations, but it's not a complete answer.
Right. Abstract concepts are tough for empiricism. So what about nativism? What do they say?
Well, Fodor, as usual, has some strong opinions. He argued that most, if not all, of our lexical concepts are innate. We're born with them.
Whoa, hold on. We're born knowing what dog and chair and justice mean.
That's what he claimed, based on the idea that learning a concept requires already having that concept. It's a bit of a mind bender, but it pushed people to think seriously about the limits of learning.
So are we doomed to only ever understand what's pre-programmed into our brains?
Well, Fodor later softened his view a bit, saying that maybe we can learn complex concepts by combining innate primitives. And even more recently, he suggested that maybe no concepts are learned in the usual sense, but are acquired biologically.
Biologically, like our genes determine our concepts.
It's more like our brains are structured to develop certain concepts given the right environmental input. It's not that specific concepts are encoded in our genes, but the capacity to form those concepts is.
So it's nature and nurture working together.
Exactly. And there are less radical nativists who argue that we have innate predispositions and learning mechanisms that guide our conceptual development. Like babies seem to have an intuitive understanding of physics and a readiness to learn language.
So it's not all blank slate, but it's not all pre-programmed either.
Right. And there's even debate about what innate even means. Some argue it's a messy concept, given the complex interplay of genes and environment.
It's always more complicated than it seems.
Yeah.
Okay, we've tackled what concepts are, how they're structured, and where they come from. Now let's get to their relationship with language. Can we even think without words?
Now, that's a question that has divided philosophers for ages. Some, like Brandom and Davidson, argue that language is absolutely essential for thought. They say that without language, we wouldn't have the capacity for belief, for understanding truth and falsity, for having genuine concepts.
So our thoughts are literally shaped by the language we speak.
That's the strong view. Davidson argued that it's through participating in a linguistic community with shared standards of meaning and truth that we develop the capacity for thought.
But what about babies? They don't have language yet, but they seem to think.
That's one of the challenges to this view. Research on infants and animals suggests that some forms of conceptual understanding might exist without language. Like, babies seem to have some understanding of other people's intentions even before they can talk.
So maybe language isn't strictly necessary for all concepts. But Davidson also had concerns about how we can know what animals are thinking without language.
Right. He used the example of a dog choosing an apple over a pear. How do we know what concepts are guiding that choice without language to articulate them? And can a dog really think, my master is home, or just, Mr. Smith is here?
It's tricky to get inside the mind of a dog.
Definitely. But critics of Davidson argue that he sets the bar too high. Even with language, we can't always be sure what someone else is thinking.
Right? Miscommunication happens all the time. Plus, there's a lot of research suggesting that animals have more sophisticated cognitive abilities than we used to think, like those caching birds who remember where they hid hundreds of seeds, and even whether someone was watching them.
That's a great example. Those birds seem to have complex representations of space, time, and even other birds' mental states.
Pretty impressive for a bird brain. But even if we accept that animals can have concepts without language, there's still the question of whether language shapes our human concepts.
Absolutely. Even if language isn't strictly necessary, it might still play a role in how we think. Some argue that concepts are prior to language, that language is just a tool for expressing pre-existing thoughts.
Like, we have the thought first, then we find the words for it.
Exactly. But others, like Carruthers and Spelk, argue that at least some of our thinking happens in language. Our inner speech, that voice in our heads, might actually be how we think through some problems.
So language isn't just output, it's part of the thinking process itself.
That's the idea. There's also evidence that engaging our linguistic system can sometimes interfere with non-linguistic tasks, suggesting that we might be using language even when we don't realize it.
Language is a cognitive crutch, or maybe a cognitive enhancer.
Possibly both. And then there's the whole question of linguistic relativity, the idea that the language we speak influences how we think.
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Yeah.
Like, if my language doesn't have a word for blue, can I even see the color blue?
The strong version, linguistic determinism, is largely discredited, but the weaker version, linguistic relativity, is still being debated. There's evidence that language can subtly shape how we perceive things like space, time, gender, even numbers.
So the language we speak might shape our reality in a way. Fascinating. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the role of concepts in philosophy itself, specifically conceptual analysis.
This is where things get really meta. Conceptual analysis is the classic philosophical method, the armchair approach to understanding the world.
No lab coats or experiments needed.
Right. It's about analyzing our concepts through careful thinking, thought experiments, and appeals to intuition. The goal is often to define a concept, to find the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under that concept.
Like, what are the essential features of knowledge? Or of justice?
Exactly. And this method has been incredibly influential in philosophy. It seems to explain how a lot of philosophical arguments work. It allows philosophy to be a priori, independent of empirical science.
But, as we've seen, finding those neat definitions is hard. And intuitions can be unreliable.
Right. Naturalists criticize conceptual analysis for those reasons. They say philosophy should be more aligned with science, focusing on empirical evidence and explanatory power.
So, are we witnessing the death of the armchair philosopher?
Well, some think so. The rise of experimental philosophy, which uses empirical methods to study philosophical intuitions, is one sign of that.
So philosophy itself is evolving alongside our understanding of concepts. Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from the nature of concepts to their structure, to their origins, their relationship with language, and their role in philosophy itself.
It's amazing how something so fundamental, something we use all the time, can be so complex and controversial.
It really highlights how much we still don't know about the mind and how it works. But hopefully, for you, our listener, this deep dive has provided some food for thought.
Some new tools for thinking about thinking itself.
Exactly. And to leave you with a final question, which view of concepts resonates most with you? Does it change how you think about your own philosophical inquiries?
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring those concepts.